In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna bid on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now, with today's guest, your host, Chris Bair.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us. And we're recording from the inside of my home. And a very good friend of mine, Brett Erickson, is here to join us. Brett, thank you for taking time. Your lovely wife did an LOA, Legacy of Agriculture, with me Christmas time. We did a couple. Did we do one or two? I can't remember, but we talked about some Christmas stories and really enjoyed having your wife on the show. And now we're back. And the purpose, what I wanted to do in this show this week, it's 4th of July weekend. We're celebrating our nation's history. We're celebrating our nation's birthday, and I have a deep respect for the military, and I have a deep respect for the men and women who sacrifice so much. And you might ask yourself, what does this have to do with agriculture? It has everything to do with agriculture, because if you go back and you study the migration in the United States so many years ago, it was really founded on military action and agriculture, planting crops, keeping the troops alive and fed and family. And you served for many years in the Navy. And that's what I want to talk about is your military experience, and share with our listeners what you did in the military. So tell us, Brett, a little bit about you and the military.
Okay, well, graduated high school in 1982, and I'm from a small town in Minnesota, Pelican Rapids, Minnesota, and it's kind of a stagnant town, and we grew up kind of poor, so it was like there was no real outlook for me to go to college. So I decided I'd join the military and get an education out of the military. So I went up to Fargo Moorhead and took the ASVAB test, and they accepted me into the military. And as I was speaking with a recruiter, I took the ASVAB, and the recruiter said, he said, you got a really good score in the ASVAB. You should consider going into nuclear power. And I was like, well, I don't know about nuclear power. And he said, well, it's the greatest thing ever. He says, all you have to do is sign a 6-year contract. And I was like, I don't know about 6 years either. So, but I got to thinking about it, and I'm like, well, I wanted.
Did you notice his verbiage? Just 6 years.
Just 6 years. That's right. They were really good at selling it. Well, I went ahead and I signed up, and I actually, when I enlisted in the Navy, I enlisted under a gas turbine electrician rating, and so I would have been working on gas turbines. So interestingly enough, I had to wait for an opening into nuclear power school before I could get in. So I waited. I went into the Navy in December of that year. It was like 2 weeks after I graduated high school. I went down and signed my paperwork and did my thing, and went home and told my mom I joined the Navy. I'm leaving in December, and she was like, "What?" And
was she in favor or not in favor?
Oh no, she didn't want me to go. So
understandable.
But I just
Navy. This is you're worldwide,
and this is in the 80s. So it was 1982 I joined. So it was not necessarily good communication at that point in time. It was pretty much letters, or if you were going to make a phone call, you had to pay Ma Bell some money. It was AT&T, and you were paying cash before you could get in there. So it was dropping quarters in the machine, or the old payphone. You're putting quarters in somewhere in the world, or you're calling collect, and collect calls were very expensive back then. And we didn't, like I said, we grew up pretty poor. Yeah. So she knew she wasn't going to have much contact with me. So she was pretty disappointed with me going in the Navy, but that's okay. It had to happen. It's like, boys cut the cord.
It's your decision. So, you're 18 years old.
Yeah.
You're out of high school.
Yep.
It's your go time.
So I had to wait until December. I worked through the summer and worked another couple odd jobs until December. And then when 2 days after Christmas, I went to Great Lakes, Illinois to boot camp. And it's cold up in Illinois in January and February. So it was not necessarily enjoyable, but we made it through it. And when that got done, I stayed there in Illinois in Great Lakes and went to my, what they call A school, or accelerated school. And that was for an electrician. So I went to electrician school, and when I graduated that, then they advanced me in rank. And then I had to wait again, and they sent me to Tennessee, and I stayed in Tennessee for 3 months. I was a master at arms, or what in that point is a military police for the Navy. and I was in charge of the restriction barracks. So I had, the people who got put on restriction, we had to take them and stay in the room where they stayed. They were kind of jailed up, so we had to stay with them for 24 hours.
So is a restriction the same thing as jail then? Is that
at that time in Tennessee, where I was in Millington, Tennessee? Yes. So,
okay?
So they got locked up, but we didn't. We would spend 24 hours on, and then we had 48 hours off.
Right.
So it was a long night shift, and being a new guy, you get to stay up all night. So we'd stay up all night, sleep a little while the next day, so you get a day and a half before you got to go back to work. So, but it was decent. And then when my billet opened up, I went to Orlando, Florida, went to nuclear power school, and it was all book learning at that point. But the nuclear power program in the Navy is designed by a guy named Rickover. And he designed it to basically be 2.5 years of college in 6 months. They just throw it at you really fast. So it was trying to absorb all that knowledge and get all that stuff. I did not do well because when I was in high school, I didn't have to study. I just go to class and get B's, so.
Right.
But there, I needed to study, but I didn't know how to study. So I ended up 2 days before the final comprehensive exam over the whole 6-month course, I failed my third subject and they just kicked me out. That was it. No more nuclear power. So I went to the fleet or on a ship, and I spent 4.5 years in San Diego on a ship. So that was the beginning, and kind of most of it. The first year and a half of my military service was pretty much schooling. So,
have you been able to use that schooling in your profession?
Oh, absolutely,
in your
absolutely.
career?
So the electrician part of it, the electrician's mate, they call it, but that. We learned to run a generator and fix electrical equipment that was shipboard electrical equipment. So a little bit different system than what we use in the United States, but it's ungrounded because you're floating in salt water on a metal can. So you can't really ground it. There's nowhere to ground it to. So you have to have an ungrounded distribution system, which means it's easier to get shocked, but if you know what you're doing, you're okay. So I worked on that. And so anything that had a wire going to it, we had to repair. Didn't matter if it was up on the main deck or up on the top, the signalman, whatever. But the electronics people who worked on the electronics, they had sonar people who worked on a sonar. They had other people who worked on other aspects of the shipboard electrical systems. But our job was to provide power to those systems. So we had generators we worked on and a bunch of other equipment that we maintained. So,
what was your favorite part of being the electrician on the ship or involved in the electricity on the ship?
It was never the same. One day to the next, 1 hour to the next was never really the same. It was like you could be very busy for 6 hours in a row, or you could be doing nothing for 6 hours. It all depends on what was going on. And if something was broken, you had to go fix it. Otherwise, there was always planned maintenance to do. So we did a lot of planned maintenance. And 3M designed a system for the Navy for them to do maintenance. And it's just very detailed. I mean, every step is step.
I would imagine being out on the ocean like that and all that salt wire, that created a lot of corrosion and a lot of electrical problems on a ship. Is that right?
Anything on the main deck was all rust. So if you go into the contactors or whatever, they're going to be rusted. So we had to carry a lot of spare parts, and what we didn't carry, we had to be able to work around. So if there was something that fried or started on fire or burned up or whatever, you had to find a way to make that equipment work with no parts sometimes.
I would venture to guess that was also during a period of time where a lot of things were still mechanical.
Oh yeah.
And then, but you were having in the 80s and 90s transitions to computers and to
it was
electronics.
MS-DOS for computers. I mean, there was no Windows. Windows didn't exist.
Right.
So as it came into the late 80s, they started bringing out Windows, but it was stupid Windows, the stuff that didn't work, So it's
DOS-based stuff.
DOS-based stuff worked, but you had to know all the commands. You had to be able to type in. It was all command line, whatever.
Yeah.
But so we had to do a lot with, as computers became prevalent or more prevalent, we had to learn those too. So,
Folks, we're going to be right back with our second segment.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday morning on WNAX. If you've missed any of our shows, you can join us on Apple and Spotify. Also on the legacyofagriculture.com has got all of our archived shows over the last almost 2 years now. We're knocking on right on 100 episodes now of the Legacy of Agriculture. We're very proud of that. We've had some outstanding interviews along the way, Brett, and we appreciate Brett Erickson, Navy man. Spent a lot of years in the Navy talking about his experiences as an electrician on a Navy ship. Brett, tell us about, in the previous segment, we had talked about some of your responsibilities, but let's dig into the nuts and bolts of what does a Navy ship look like?
Well, the ship that I was on, in the 80s, the ship that I was on was actually built in 1971. They launched it on the 4th of December in 1971. So it was a little bit older by the time I got there. I got there in 1982, so it was 11 years old. And there's a lot of repairs necessary. Things were starting to wear out. When I reported aboard the ship, they went into the shipyards right away. Mm-hmm. And in the shipyards, it was in NASCO in San Diego, they lifted the entire ship up out of the water. So they floated the ship into this dock, and then they blew the water out of the ballast tanks that sank the dock. And then the dock lifted up and lifted the whole ship up out of the water. And then we just went to work. There was welders, there was electricians, there was just anything and everyone that was there. So there was no sleeping. Sleep was very difficult on the ship because they were always grinded, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
But you were expected to stay on the ship when they were doing all this maintenance while it was being docked.
Yep.
What could go wrong there?
Right, I don't know, yeah. Well, the ship I was on was designed and built to land on the beach and dump Marines off so that the Marines could go do ground fighting.
Okay.
So we carried equipment, so it was 69 feet, 9.5 inches wide, and it was 563 feet long. So it was 8,300 tons with a full load. The draft was 15 feet when it was fully loaded, so it sank 15 feet into the water when it was fully loaded. It had twin screws, so 2 propellers, and those screws had variable pitch on the propeller. Mm-hmm. So you could go all the way forward or all the way backwards. And you could take one forward, one backwards.
The ship off the beach when the Marines would land onto the beach.
And there was times when we beached where we actually had to take those screws and run one forward, one backwards, and take it and just wiggle it so we could get it off. Because it was stuck. And we'd stab it into the sand and it would get stuck there. So we had to work it to get it off.
And then your weight changes as guys get back off.
You bet. Well, that's what you hope, because a lot of that stuff that's on the front of the ship will allow you to come out of the water a little bit better, and you can get out. But what was interesting about that beaching process was it would hit the sand and it would hit the beach, and then we would unload a ramp and we would start dumping the Marines off. The whole inside had a center section of the ship that was hollow that we could carry these tanks. They called them LVTs, landing vehicle tanks. They were amphibious. So they'd go in the water, they had 2 little propellers on them, they'd drive around, and they carried like 16 Marines apiece. And then they would go off with tracks. They had tracks on them, and then one 50 cal machine gun on the top. And they would drive up over the ramp, and they would hit the beach from the front, and they would go out the back and attack from both sides. And then the helicopters would be flying over, and it was something. It was something to see.
Yeah, I bet that gives you shivers, or did it scare
It was really good. No, it didn't scare me. It was really cool. I thought, this is awesome. Let's go get them, you know.
you were smart enough to be scared, right?
Let's kick some butt, you know. Yeah. So, but we had troop capacity.
Okay, what were some of the beaches that you landed on, just out of curiosity?
Well, we were in the Philippines, and we did some operations with the Philippine Marines. And then we went to Korea, and we did operations with the ROKs, they call them, Republic of Korea Marines. And those are some of the toughest men I've ever met in my life. Small stature, but they were tough. I mean, just
mean.
Tough. Just tough.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, but it was odd because you would watch them, if they're in a formation, they were so close. One guy would have his arms around another guy, and he'd be just listening to the instructor teach him something, you know, and it was just, you could tell they were very, very close friends.
Yeah.
So, but it was interesting to watch them, but man, they were tough. But when we did operations with them, we'd take the Korean Marines and dump them off and let them at it. And they'd come back 3 days later just covered in mud and grime and slime, and we'd be like, oh man, I had my 3 meals today. How are you doing? You know, so
come on board. There's the shower.
Yeah. Please.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, we didn't have much for armament on the ship. There was a couple 3-inch guns, which were cannons, and they could shoot something coming in. They did, before we got off, they put on what they call a phalanx system, which is a anti-aircraft and anti-missile. So if you had a missile come screaming at the ship, this phalanx system looked like R2-D2 with a barrel out of it, and it would shoot one bullet every square inch in a pattern to try to shred that missile as it came in. And it was very effective. It worked very well. So,
Did you have missiles that were shot in at your boat?
oh no, they would do test missiles. And
Oh,
things
they
like
do
that.
test
Yeah,
missiles,
they'd
okay.
be shooting a test missile at us, and they'd light up that phalanx. Just, it was crazy sounding, and it just shredded. It just come to pieces.
While you were on the ship?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Oofta. I don't know
We did
if I'd like
helicopter
that very well.
operations. We had helicopters that landed on a ship, things like that. So it was pretty cool. There was a lot of things that ship did that, you don't really think about. Like we had a Coast Guard helicopter. We were on a drug interdiction cruise on the coast of Mexico. And we had a Coast Guard helicopter that was flying with a Coast Guard cutter. And the cutter went off somewhere and the helicopter crashed. So it ended up in the ocean. So we were, I suppose probably, I think 18 hours away from this chopper when it went down, but they didn't have anybody to get it out of the water. Well, we had a couple of boom cranes that came out and would lift our stores off from the dock.
Right.
When, we were refilling with our foods and things like that. So we went full steam ahead, headed down to them. They were off the coast of Mexico. The chopper was, but the whole crew survived. They got picked up by a freighter, and we went down to get the helicopter.
Oh, okay.
So our job was to get the helicopter out of the water. It took us all day, and it was just a mess because they had it hooked on and they were pulling it up out of the water, and the winch died. So it come on loose and hit the water, and it rolled over.
Oh.
So now we got to pick it up upside down, full of water,
Full of
try and
water.
get it out. So it took us all day. Every time they tried to pick it up, the generator would trip, or the breaker would trip on a generator, and to go back down in the water I go. So finally got it up, finally got it in. In the process of doing that, they had a topping winch on this cargo boom that a cable ran straight out to the tip, and then they had another winch that would lift.
Right.
Well, the topping winch is what lifted it up, the arm up and back. And that topping winch, the breaker, the contactor that ran it stuck and got frozen on. And it had done that before, and it just took that arm and bent it right in half.
Oh,
So
because of the...
Because of the force and the strength of that winch that was drawing that in, it would bend that entire boom in half. Well, there was an electrician up there named Gregory Carr, and he went diving underneath the helicopter while it's in the air, dove through one of these little hatches that's about this big around, ran down the hallway and flipped the breaker off to shut the winch off. Otherwise, it would have done that, and it would have dropped the helicopter right on the deck.
Again.
It would have been, but it would have been on a deck this time.
Right.
It would have been bad. So he got some kind of an award for it, and I thought it should have been one that's like, hey, you're dumb. Why did you go underneath a hanging load?
We don't care about safety. It's just, you're the winner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So yeah, we did
So how are the ships powered? Engine?
generators. They had diesel driven engines. So they had 8-cylinder Alco diesels that ran 750 kilowatt generators, and they had 3 of those.
Okay.
So we would connect them in parallel or separate them and run them by themselves, depending on what loads we needed to feed on the ship and what we were doing. So our bow thruster, that was basically a propeller, went horizontally across the very lowest point in the front of the ship, could push the front left and right. Well, we could do that with a variable pitch in the props. We'd go one way or the other. But that ran off a 900 horsepower DC motor. So we had a 900 amp breaker. That was a max that our generator could feed at 750 kilowatts. And so that generator had to be dedicated to that motor. So
I've never heard of an Alco engine before.
Alco diesels, that's all we had.
That's
on
an
there.
inline 8?
No, it was a V8.
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 It was a V8.
V8 on that one, and our main engines, that we had 16-cylinder Alco diesels that ran the propellers. And they ran through a big gearbox that drove that propeller.
Wow,
So
that is a lot.
it was a lot of power.
That was a lot of horsepower.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yep.
So is there anything, as we come down to the end of our segment, we've got about 45 seconds left, any little snippet you could tell us about the ship that's interesting?
Well, it was haze gray, and they call it haze gray and underway. So I mean, if we were out at sea, it was haze gray and underway. If you're underway,
You're on your way.
you're on your way.
On
Yep.
your way going somewhere.
Yep.
Well, Brett, we're coming down to the end of our second segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be right back after a commercial break. We'd like to appreciate our sponsors, Pfeiffer Auction and Realty, and also Richard's Repair out of Larchwood, Iowa. We appreciate the good people at Richard's Repair. For complete listing of all of our auctions coming in the summer and the fall of 2025, you'll want to go to our website at pfeifers.com.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffer's.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Hey folks, we're back. I'm Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture. Thank you for joining us on WNAX Radio, Apple, Spotify, legacyofagriculture.com. And Brett, thanks for joining us. We've had a really good first two segments talking about your Navy experience. And what did you enjoy most about being in the Navy?
Well, the Navy's a big machine. There's a lot of things that happen in the Navy. The Navy is if you look at all the branches of the military, the Navy does what every other branch does and then some. And we do it from the ocean. So it's like they do Marine Corps stuff. They do Special Forces stuff. They do Air Force stuff. They do land-based stuff. They do anything and everything any other branch of the service does, but they do it basically based from the ocean.
On a ship.
On a ship.
Yep.
From a ship or from a submarine or something like that, or from a PT boat or from some kind of boat, right? They're out there. So it's pretty cool to be part of that kind of an organization. But another thing that they did that wasn't really necessarily broadcast in a lot of ways is they do so much humanitarian efforts out there. They have a hospital ship it's nuclear powered and it can basically power an entire city. So they bring in even an aircraft carrier. They bring an aircraft carrier in. They can power up an entire city, and they have a full-blown hospital on board. And the hospital ship that they have is staffed with doctors and everything else. So in the event of a hurricane, in the event of some sort of a natural disaster that causes someone in the world a lot of heartache and problems, we can go and help them. And one of the things we did when I was on my ship is we did this, what they call a Project Hand Clasp, which is we went and in the Philippine Islands, there was an orphanage that was run by a bunch of nuns and a Catholic priest. And we went and they needed a lot of help with their infrastructure. Their buildings were falling apart and needed painting and things like that. So we grabbed a bunch of guys and went and painted an orphanage. And I remember the priest said, "Does anybody want to try some papaya?" And I didn't know what that was. Or mango. He said, "You want to try mango?" I'd never had mango in my life. I never tasted it.
Right.
And he came in with this mango that he had just gone out in the jungle and picked. And it was the most delicious piece of fruit I've ever had in my life. It was
Just
amazing.
a regular old mango.
Just a regular old mango, but it was just fresh off the vine. It was unbelievable. Just fantastic. But that was fun, doing that sort of thing. And those humanitarian efforts, I guess, are a big part of what my heart was led to do, is to help. And that's kind of why I wanted to be in the military in the first place, besides in education and to get out of my hometown. I wanted to help. I wanted to help the country. So I got out there and I did that in the Navy, and then, just all kinds of stuff like that. So
very good. Well, I think that's really neat. So what happened after your military experience?
Well, I got out of the military and I came back to the state of Minnesota. That's where I was from. And I applied to the state of Minnesota in 1988 for a journeyman's electrical license.
Okay.
And I'd been in the Navy being an electrician. I was an electrician already. So I'd been doing that for 4.5 years on a ship and studied it prior to that. And Minnesota said, well, the Navy won't basically validate any of your time or what you did when you were in the military. They just said you were in. So we can't give you a journeyman's license. I was like, well, I'm not going to go and be an apprentice for 4 years before I could become a journeyman. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to college. So I went to college for robotics, and I got into robots and doing things like that. So it was a natural stepping stone to go from, nuclear power back to being an electrician, and then from being an electrician to go into robotics and study those things. So I studied electronics again, and then went and studied robots and how everything works. So hydraulics, pneumatics, machine tool and die, that sort of thing. So tons of stuff. And then when I got out of that, I went and worked for a company that made suspension assemblies for computer hard drives. Mm-hmm. And that was here in the Sioux Falls area. I met my wife in college, got married, and we moved here to the Sioux Falls area, Valley Springs, a little town outside of Sioux Falls. And we had 4 kids, and we started raising kids and going to work. So I was going to work in the robotics area. Well, then that company wound up shutting down, closing its doors. They moved over to Thailand. And I ended up back into the agricultural industry because, from growing up on a farm, it was kind of a natural progression.
You're in
to fall
Minnesota,
back into
South
it.
Dakota.
Yeah, there's a lot of ag around here. Well, there was a guy in Pipestone that was installing and servicing robots that milk cows. So it's like, well, I know how to milk cows and I know how to fix robots. So it seemed like
You
a
know what
natural,
both are.
seemed like a natural thing to go to work for the guy. So I went and interviewed with him, and sure enough, he hired me, and I worked for him for 2.5 years and installed a whole bunch of Lely dairy robotics. And it was an interesting system. I learned a ton, and it was good.
You know, we did a legacy of agriculture. It's been within the last year with Aaron Buchanan, who works for a company, and that's what he does is he builds turntables. He builds this, works for a company that builds all of that state-of-the-art electronics and milking machines, etc. And it's absolutely crazy how well cows are kept now.
Oh yeah.
And
They got it
how
good.
and how well they're taken care of, and how gentle the milking process is now, and how fine-tuned the entire process is.
Yeah.
We were having a conversation this morning at work, and one of my team members was saying that there's one dairy that produces 280,000 gallons of milk a day.
Wow.
280,000
That's a lot.
gallons of milk a day. And it's, to me, it's staggering. And the thing that's really beautiful about South Dakota agriculture is the dairy industry is just growing by leaps and bounds.
It's phenomenal. Yeah.
20% in 1 year. A couple of years ago, the dairy cow population had increased by 20%. And you think about it, why not?
Yeah.
You know, why not?
Yeah, we got the grass, we got the feed, and
We got the grass, we got the feed, we got the infrastructure, we've got all of that.
we got the land to spread the manure. You got to get rid of the
Yes.
manure. We got
Yep.
the land to spread it. So
Yep, that's
all those
exactly
things is
right.
great. Yep.
So tell me a little bit more about that, your experience with putting robotics in, and what were some of the good things and the bad things.
Well, I started out, and the guy that I was working for was kind of, he'd been doing that for like 2 years. He'd been working on the robots, and he started it himself, and he was the only guy. And as a business owner and the only guy doing the robot side of it, he was pretty well stretched, pretty
Yeah.
thin. So he didn't have a lot of time to focus on all of the aspects in the robot side that he probably should have. So some of the maintenance had slipped. So when I got hired, I said, I'm catching this that the maintenance isn't getting done. And that's also a price point, because as you're doing the maintenance on the robots, you're replacing little pieces of equipment because they're time to be replaced. And maybe they work still, but not as good as they could. So,
Sure.
when you replace those components, you're charging the customer for components as well. So he was losing out on some of the profits he could have made doing that. So I started up, and I started documenting his PM procedures, and started setting it up so that I could basically time it so that when it was time to do, according to the company, they said, at 6-month intervals, you should do these things. I set that all up, and I kind of based it basically on my military experience with 3M and the PMs that they did. Said, okay, we're gonna write instructions for the next guy when
Right.
he comes on that can do this, and I'm gonna write a spreadsheet to tell him this is when this happens.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Hey folks, we're coming down to the end of our third segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. We're going to be right back after a commercial break.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffer's.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Hey folks, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture, Chris Bair. Thank you for joining us on our fourth and final segment on this Saturday morning. If you haven't heard us before, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to hear some of our past episodes, you can go to legacyofagriculture.com, Apple or Spotify, and listen to any of our past episodes. Brett, thank you for joining us this morning. We've had a great conversation about you getting into the Navy right out of high school. Then you went into robotics in the milking industry, and you didn't stay there. So what happened?
Well, I had my own business doing software development for automated machinery, and I was doing that kind of on the side with the support of my boss that was a robotics salesman. And so every once in a while I'd be like, okay, I'm taking Friday off. I got to go work on a contract. And I'd go work on a contract on a Friday. And I was working on a contract, and this guy that I used to work with at the manufacturing company that made the suspension assemblies calls me up, and he says, hey, there's a job open at Basin Electric. You should just throw your resume in there. I'm like, okay, well, I'm working for this guy full-time on the road, fixing robots all over the country. And then I'm doing my own business. So I grabbed my LinkedIn profile and just made it like a PDF file, and I sent it. That was it. That was my application. Here you go. Take this, because this is what I got.
Take it or leave it.
Yeah, I just sent it off to Basin Electric. Well, sure enough, I got a phone call and I got interviewed. So I got an interview from them, and I drove up to north of Brookings. They were building a power plant up there. And I interviewed with this guy, and he's showing me around, and I'm like, oh, I think I could probably figure this out. You know, it's the electrical world. They're building it. And through the course of the interview, as my computer experience came into play, and all of my naval experience came into play, and all of the other things that I've worked on and things like that through my life. And I left, and they said, well, you know, go ahead and fill out your mileage. And I was like, what are you talking about? And, well, they paid me for my mileage to go drive up there for the interview. And I'm like, I've never heard of that before in my life. You're going to pay me to come and interview? Sweet. So I got
You never turned that down.
No,
right?
no. I sent it in and I got paid for it. I was like, that's pretty cool. Well, I was working at a place down in Canton doing another contract and working with a guy that I used to work with at the manufacturing facility.
Right.
And they had gotten a brand new machine, so we're working on commissioning it and getting it started up, and all the technical nuts and bolts you got to get figured out to say this goes here and this goes there. And I got a phone call, and it was from those guys at Basin Electric. They said, we'd like to offer you a job. And I said, I'll take that job, because it was a very substantial pay raise from what I was getting working for the guy in Pipestone. So then I had to go, and I had to actually quit my first job. I'd never quit a job before. I'd always just either gone and done something different, right? Where it's like, okay, now we're going to part ways because I'm going on to the Navy, or now we're going to do this because I'm changing my life and this is the way it's going to go. But I never actually just said, you know, look, I'm putting in my 2 weeks notice. So I had to put my 2 weeks notice in, and this, you know, that's the weirdest feeling to do that, but I did.
How'd it go?
It went pretty well. He was sad to see me go, and he said, is there any way I can keep you to stay? And I told him, well, I said, here's how much of a pay raise I'm getting. And he goes, no, I really can't do that. I said, I know.
That's why.
I know you can't. That's why I'm going to move on. So,
Right.
So I mean, it was a kind of a money thing, but it worked out pretty good. I worked for them for 12 years, but I went to work for Basin Electric, and they finished building and commissioned a 300 megawatt power plant up by Brookings. So there I was back in the power industry and producing power again, like when I was in the Navy. So it was funny how all of my naval experience and even in high school, when I took an electronics class in high school, all of those things kind of, you know, robotics school and nuclear power school, all that stuff kind of came right back full circle. And here I was back at a power plant again. And I always thought that was pretty interesting, but it was a good experience to go there. The technology had changed quite a bit, because when I was on the ship, and if you put two generators in parallel, it's easy to make things blow up because they have to be perfectly synchronized, same speed, same voltage, same everything, and then you can close the circuit breaker and it works. If they're out of sync, things blow up.
Right.
We used to do that in the Navy when we parallel two generators with a stick that we'd put in the handle of the breaker, and we'd watch the sinker scope and try to get her to close, you know, right at the end of it. And if you did it right, it went good. If you did it wrong, it didn't go so good.
Not so happy.
Things shook and the generator growled at you and things were not happy. The lights dim, you know, all this kind of stuff was bad.
And then the captain came down to see you.
What's going on down there? Well, now they just hit a button, and they have auto synchronizers that take those two generators, or even when they're hooking it up to the grid, which is huge, but they take a 300 megawatt generator and put it on the grid. It automatically synchronizes. And when that thing closes, it closes perfectly on time every time.
Wow.
So it's pretty interesting to watch. So
what were some of your favorite memories in being in the power plant world or the Navy? What's some of your favorite memories? I know you're a people person. I know you have tons of friends all over the world.
Yeah. That was really cool. You know, doing that, I got to meet people from everywhere and all different walks of life. And I'm always interested in humans. And so when I talk to people, I like to find out what makes them tick. And they could be the most oddball, different person from myself that I've ever met in my life. And I will sit down and have a 3-hour conversation with them just to pick their brain and see what makes them go. And that interests me. But in the power plant world, and coming back to the power plant world, it was all of that, and then the personality types that were a little bit different, because when you're in the heavy industrial world, the personalities tend to be a lot more aggressive, a lot more strong personalities. So then you have to be able to stick up for yourself. You have to be able to say, you know what, I don't think I'm going to let you talk to me that way or whatever, right? Sometimes
I'm going to knock your lights
sometimes
out.
it's going to be a lot more
Quote,
coarse.
unquote.
Yeah, a lot more coarse. But either way, it was interesting to be in that environment again.
So I'm going to throw a curveball at you. What would you tell our young high school listeners that were wanting to get into the world that you got into? What kind of advice would you give them?
If you're going to go into the military, pick something that you enjoy doing, because the military is a vast machine, and somewhere in a branch of the military, there is something that you are very interested in, that you like right now, and they'll pay you for it, and they'll send you places to go do it. And some of these kids nowadays, the military's changed from when I was in. There's drone pilots and there's all these other things, and that stuff can change it around a little bit, where now it's even way more technical than when I was in.
Right.
But that technology doesn't really change the fact of things still work the same way they worked when I was young. They just have different knobs to turn to make them work, right? So the principles are still the same. So stick with the basics, do something you love, and find a way to do it. But the military was an awesome experience for me because I got to meet so many people from different walks of life. It inspired me to become a better person, because those people came from different walks of life and had grown up differently than me. And I was like, wow, I didn't have to go through that. I was a farm kid and we had good things. We had meat on the table every night.
Yeah.
These guys are like, well, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes we ate, sometimes we didn't. Or some of them were like, yeah, we had, I don't know what you're talking about. We live rich, so all different walks of life.
The military does that. That's a very interesting component as to how people, you could have a school teacher and then you have a farmer and then you got a rich kid from New York or whatever that might be.
Open your ears and open your mind, you can learn a lot.
That's right. Well, coming down to the end of our fourth segment, I would like to thank you for joining us on our 4th of July weekend, Legacy of Agriculture. It's been a great honor. You've been a great friend for a lot of years. We were close neighbors at one time, and then somebody moved away. That would be me. I moved away on to up bigger and better things, right?
Yeah.
But anyways, we thank you, Brett, very much for joining us. I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors, Richard's Repair out of Larchwood, Iowa, and also Piper Auction Realty and Land Management for a complete listing of all of our summer 2025 and fall auction. We've got a very, very busy schedule this fall. Go to pifers.com, or you can simply give us a call, 605-836-2277. Pifers, nobody does it better.
Here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna bid on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bair, sponsored by Pifers Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pifers at 605-836-2277.